This is what the passage says. John 2:12-25. After the wedding in Capernaum, or in Cana, excuse me. After this, Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and the Jews went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So yesterday we talked a little bit about where Capernaum is, and looked at some pictures of ancient Capernaum. We talked about the timing of the event, that the Passover was at hand, it was near. He went to Jerusalem. Talked about what the Passover is, and that John calls it the Jews' Passover. When it was instituted as the Lord's Passover. Because who passed over? God did, right? The Holy Spirit did. So is there a deeper meaning to John now changing it from the Lord's Passover to the Jews' Passover? We can't know for sure, but certainly Passover had degenerated into this sort of carnival within the temple, sort of Black Friday in the temple, and that was a problem, right? So maybe he is making a statement on that. We don't know for sure. So it had degenerated. I've just finished telling you about how the practice came to be, that originally people brought their own lambs, people brought all the provisions they needed, and then it changed so that the people were able to buy those things, exchange their money when they got to Jerusalem. However, it started outside of the temple. So here's this big area where the people are. That's the court of the Gentiles. That's where the story takes place. But originally, it was in the streets and just outside the temple that you could go and buy a lamb for sacrificing, or exchange your money or something like that. But over time, it changed, and it was moved into the actual temple area. Now let's talk about the temple a little bit, because you can see here that it was very. Oh, and by the way, I should add something else, because there's nothing wrong with selling lambs, right? There's nothing wrong with exchanging money. It's a legitimate business, right? But probably not in God's most holy place, right? In the temple where God dwelt. And also, as often happens, the lenders, the money lenders, were charging exorbitant interest. They were trying to get wealthy off of these people coming to worship, and the price gouging, as it's called, like the inflated prices, were horrific. So what happens, for example, to prices when something is really popular? Yeah.
They go up?
They go up. especially as the availability of that thing goes down, right? We saw this with the price, and maybe still are still seeing it with the price of wood. There's a scarcity of wood available, and so if you wanted to build your wooden fence, you were waiting. It's like, no, next summer because the price went way up. But sometimes that happens artificially. Oh, everybody likes this. Everybody needs a lamb. Let's jack up the prices, right? Last year, Lane wanted I know Lane's like 20 years old, 22 years old actually now, but 21 last Christmas. He wanted a Lego Millennium Falcon. And that thing was so expensive. And it was so hard to find. And every time I found it someplace else, it was more expensive because there was a scarcity of it. And so they weren't just selling lambs. They weren't just exchanging money. They were charging exorbitant prices and exorbitant taxes to do that. And so it was a conglomeration of things that made it displeasing to the Lord. I think it says here that the normal exchange rate was pushed up by a number of additional percent, an additional I think 5% or something like that. So they're charging interest for that. So imagine you've got all of this commerce going on right in the middle of the temple, the place where they were supposed to be worshiping. And it became a place of profit, of big business. Now, I don't know, anybody experienced Black Friday before? I'm not as big a Black Friday. Like, I was once all in, partly because it was a sport. You know what I'm saying? And if it's a sport, I must win. And so I had a game plan, and especially when we had Thanksgiving here, I knew where all the stores were. I knew what all, and I'd like prioritize the gifts, right? So the Game Boy's high, so we got it. It's going to be. And I remember my sister like finding the last Game Boy and reaching in the bin and taking it and throwing it over to me, and I grabbed it. It's like, yeah, touchdown! I didn't do that. So imagine that. Imagine that pre-COVID hysteria, right? In your sanctuary. I think most people would be like, oh, that's not what this place is. That's not why we're supposed to be here, right? And so that's kind of what was going on in more modern terms in the temple. So let's talk about the temple a little bit. This is on page 65 in your book if you want to put a finger in there and go back. The word that is translated temple in John 2:14 refers to the overall temple. So this whole thing is the temple, but it's split into different places. So you've got the court of the Gentiles, you've got the outer court up here, and then you have the holy place that's between the outer court and then the most holy place, in that kind of yellowish area. That was the most holy place. That's where the presence of God dwelt, in the temple. But when John's talking about the temple, he's talking about the whole thing. Technically, that most holy place is the temple. But the whole thing is the Temple Mount. And it was massive. And you can see that because those are people. Those little ants there are people. It was a massive place. So you can see that where all those people are, that's the court of the Gentiles. Anyone could enter. You didn't have to be Jewish to enter the court of the Gentiles. And it was there that the money changers and the animal sellers were conducting their lucrative business. And so to give you a little bit of an idea of how big the temple was, that's a church that would fit 400 people. Yeah, it's big, right?
That would fit a lot.
That would fit a lot of people. And there were a lot of people there. There were a lot of people there when Jesus cleansed the temple. And so then it also talks about porches. Now, when we think of a porch, we think of something you sit on up a little up higher or elevated or whatever. The porch was a covered colonnade that you could walk under, and so when there was inclement weather, when there was bad weather, people could gather. So this is a porch, but imagine under here there are columns and there's a covered area, and it's huge, right? Because you see all these little people; they fit a lot of people under that colonnade. I think you see kind of a ground level view of it here. Yeah, so that's kind of a ground level view that it had large columns, huge columns, and this may have been where the money changers were. I don't think we can know for sure, but that may have been where the money changers were. And hundreds of thousands of Jewish and Gentile citizens would visit to Jerusalem and visit the temple during the Passover. So there would have been a huge crowd around when Jesus was cleansing that temple, which is interesting to me because we don't read of anybody like resisting, right? Isn't that weird? So I'm going to read to you this description of the temple, the court of the Gentiles, and we'll go on from there. The great court of the Gentiles, which formed the lowest or outer enclosure of the temple, was paved with the finest variegated marble. According to Jewish tradition, it formed a square of 750 feet. Its name is derived from the fact that it was open to all, Jews or Gentiles, provided they observed the prescribed rules of form and reverence. So you couldn't go in there with, a sandwich sign saying, buy yourself sandwiches here or something. You had to keep rules. In this court, tradition places eating and sleeping apartments for the Levites and a synagogue. The noise, especially, and not to mention the smell of this event, all those animals in there, on the eve of the Passover must have been most disturbing. For there the oxen, sheep, and doves selected as fit for sacrifices were sold in a market. And here were those tables of the money changers that the Lord overthrew when he drove from his father's house them that bought and sold. So that's a little description of the temple itself. Now let's talk about what's really important. By the way, that's a human being there. So that gives you an idea of how tall that is. I don't think he's a particularly short human being, although Jews were kind of short. So
back in my day,
that's another church. So let's talk about what's really important about this story. Or I shouldn't say what's really important. I should say who is really important. What is John's thesis statement in John 20:31? Yeah. Yeah, these were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So everything John writes is telling us this. It's telling us who is Jesus, who is this guy. And so this is not a story about the temple. It's not even a story about the cleansing of the temple. It's a story about Jesus. And so as with everything we talk about in this year in this class, we want to know, what does this tell us about Jesus? Because he is not just the master of the events, he is the master of the universe. And Jesus is filled with righteous indignation, which can be a little disconcerting to us because it's like we think of Jesus as Mr. Nice Guy, right? He's so nice, he's kind, he's gentle, and here he is, with a whip and flipping tables, and money flying and little sheep going, I'm in trouble, and running away. I mean, it isn't the picture we get of Jesus. But the prophecy in Zechariah is true. that zeal for God's house consumed him. And it was a righteous indignation. So he takes some rushes and makes a whip out of that, a scourge out of that, and he drives out the sheep and the oxen and those that tended to them and were selling them. He overturns the tables of the money changers, and the coins go flying everywhere. And I can imagine all the men down on their hands and knees grabbing up as much money and probably some extra people going, look, pretty money, and trying to grab it. I mean, what I picture in my mind is this chaotic scene, right? And maybe that's partly why nobody did anything to him. I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where it's just pure chaos. But there's fight, flight, or freeze. And I think there were a lot of frozen people there, what just happened? What's going on? And I think that might be part of why nobody responded. But we'll talk more about that. And so he concluded by saying, "You won't make my Father's house a house of trade. You won't turn my Father's house into Walmart." And no one tried to resist him. Not one. And that might have partially been because of his boldness. So we're going to go through some slides, and each slide has two things on it that you're supposed to fill in. So you're going to see these things again in the quiz, so make sure you know these, okay? So they're kind of connected to one another. This first one isn't the most important one, but I'm going to let you fill in your blanks. So we see the boldness and strength of Jesus. We see the boldness and strength of Jesus. The next line in this thing that I don't read anyway says, Christ was no sissy. There we go.
Proved his man.
That's it. And that's true. I mean, we do tend to look at Jesus as this wimpy little, nice milquetoast guy. He walked on water. He cleared the temple. I mean, he had power. He had, I think he probably I know he looked like any other Jew, but there was a power in him because he was a God-man that others did not have. He was a carpenter, right? He worked with his hands. He was probably a very fit man, as many are that do manual labor. And he wasn't timid and shy. He wasn't retiring. He was bold. He was courageous. Sometimes just with his words, but here with his actions. Yeah.
I mean, he was in the synagogue and
Yeah. Yeah, very courageous. These are the Jewish leaders, right? And we're going to read in John 3. He says to Nicodemus, who's one of the most powerful people in the country, he says, "You are the teacher of Israel, and you don't understand this." Like he's saying, how can you not understand this? I mean, he confronted this very powerful man, Nicodemus. So Jesus knew from the beginning, from day one, not his birth, but he knew from the beginning, certainly from the time that he was in the wilderness and forward, what his future was. Sometimes I think the scariest thing to know is what's going to happen in the future, right? And he knew. He knew he was going to a cross. He knew he was going to be whipped. He knew that he was that hour was coming when he would go through such agony. He never flinched. He never, one moment in the garden, if it's possible, take it away from me. But Lord, not what I will, what you will. And so he was powerful in every sense of the word. He never backed down. And he walked with his face set like flint to Golgotha. So he faced the cross and the grave with with courage. He confronted the leadership. He confronted the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He called them vipers and dogs and whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. He reserved his harshest words for those who were the most powerful, the very people who would kill him. And he did it anyway. So he was bold and strong. I just wouldn't use the word sissy. And then we see the holiness and wrath of God. Now, that whole idea of God's wrath kind of makes us squeamish. By the way, have you ever heard of, sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? Have you read that? Middle school or something, Jonathan Edwards. I read that my junior year of high school at Bellevue West. We read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I wasn't a believer at the time. And my teacher went on and on and on about this fire and brimstone speech and how he was yelling and how he was this fiery preacher. Actually, Jonathan Edwards read his sermons in monotone. And by the time he was done with his sermons, people were weeping. Because of his power, because of his truth that he was speaking, because they understood that God is holy. And he doesn't wink at sin. He doesn't say, oh, that's okay. I really like you. So, I'll let it slide this time. He's not your grandpa, right? I remember when Josh was little, he was probably 3. And I don't know what he did. But he tipped me off. And so I went over and I was angry and I probably was too harsh with him. And Josh looks at me and says, Mommy, I don't like your attitude right now. And my mom is over in the corner laughing, right? And I'm not, and I'm like, I'm not real thrilled with yours either. And I look over at my mom and I'm like, you are not helping. If the little 3-year-old Amy would have said that to you, you wouldn't be happy, right? Something happens when you become a grandparent, Oh, it's okay. She's so cute. Let her go, and now God's not your grandpa. God's not God doesn't have grandchildren. I told you that. And so God does not wink at sin. Look, sin, our sin, my sin, put Jesus on that cross. God's Son died because I am a sinner. How can anything that costly for God be cheap? And so God is wrathful towards sin. He loves us, but he hates our sin, which is why he went to those lengths to take care of it, because he loves us and wants to spend eternity with us. So God doesn't wink at our sin, and neither should we. Alice, Jesus on the cross, that seems like a pretty big deal. So he was enraged that his father's house was being desecrated, and he would not permit it to continue. And so he cleansed the temple. And Jesus is that still that same Jesus today. He despises sin. It's an affront to God. And he will deal with it. He'll deal with it right now. He's dealt with it on the cross. But he will deal with our sin. There is no such thing as a victimless sin. Even if you're the only one, there's always a victim. There's no such thing as a victimless sin. And Scripture tells us that we will be what's the word I want to disciplined. It's been paid for, but there are consequences for sin, right? Sometimes they're just natural consequences. I just read a story yesterday in the paper that 2 guys that were somewhere, a woman ran into a shop and started saying that she thought, that 2 friends were passed out in a car. And there happened to be an off-duty Douglas County sheriff there. And he ran out and he noticed realized that they were probably both overdosed on drugs. Ran to his car, got Narcan, which is an anti-narcotic, undoes the effects of an overdose, and saved both their lives. Their costs, they could have died, right? But there's also, he will deal with it someday as well. This is the now and the not yet. Now we live in this yucky world that has been invaded by sin, not only in the world, but in our own hearts and lives. But Jesus intends to make all of that. And someday, he will make all of that. So we see the holiness and the wrath of God. And then we see the deity and authority of Christ. It's strange, as I already mentioned, that nobody fought back. Nobody tried to stop him. There were temple police in there. There were ruling authorities in there. Now, maybe they were just shocked, but I think it had something to do with his authority. Something about him was like, better stay away. And nobody tried to stop him. The only response of the people to what Jesus was doing, to the cleansing of the temple, was to ask him. And what do they ask him? They ask him this in, you call it, I'll talk about that. Okay, we'll get to that. The only thing that they did was to ask him, what gives you the authority to do this? Let me ask you something. If you did something wrong, and you were hauled into Mrs. Schraub's office, it was that bad, right? And you rose above the level of Mr. Hood. And she says, you have an out-of-school suspension. Would you say, where do you get the authority to do that? No one in this room, right? She could fire me, and I'm not going to quite talk to her. I'll just kind of pack up my stuff and go, right? And I'm older than she is. I could have been her teacher, right? But she has that authority within herself, and she has that authority by virtue of who she is. And both of true of Christ. He had that authority in himself, but he also had that authority because he was God. He is God. And he has absolute authority to do that. And so then how do we see? So these were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So how do we see then the not just the authority, but the deity of Christ? So we see that when he says he calls the temple my Father's house. He is the Son of God. That alone gives him authority. And it shows his deity. And he was jealous to preserve the honor and the holy purpose of God's temple, the place where God dwells. And secondly, he claims that he will raise his own body from the dead. That's the whole thing there. The whole thing when he's saying, you destroy this temple and I'll raise it back up in 3 days. He was calling himself the temple. He was associating himself with the temple. I am the temple. And I will die. You will kill me. So you knock me down and you kill me, and I will come back to life. And so this is a really important verse for Christology, for understanding who Christ is. You crucify me, and I'll come back from the dead. And he's saying that he's God. That's something, resurrecting the dead, and particularly to resurrect yourself, is something only God can do. Now, there's misunderstanding here. They think he's talking about the actual temple. Again, we see that frequently in John. But the disciples didn't understand until he rose from the dead. And then they looked back and went, oh, yeah, that's what he was talking about. And so, interestingly, 3 years later, this statement is what got Jesus in trouble. At his trial, they said, he said he'd destroy the temple and he'd raise it back in 3 days. And it came back on him. They would distort his words. He didn't say, I will destroy the temple. He said, if you destroy the temple, I will build it. And even more amazingly, there's this hint in the Gospels that the Jewish leaders understood exactly what Jesus meant by his words. And they were destroying the temple, right? They were in the middle of destroying the temple. That's why he cleansed it. But even more than that, as I just told you, he was claiming to be the temple. Jesus is the temple? What does he mean by that? How is Jesus the temple? What was the purpose of the temple?
Only that you can pray and all the rest
Yeah, so where did they connect with God? In the temple, right? And why was that the place where they connected with God? Because what? Because that's where God was. Jesus is the temple because the temple was the place on earth where God dwelt, where God's presence dwelt. But when Jesus was on earth, he was the place on earth where God dwelt. The temple was the place where the Jews would go to connect with God, to worship God. When Jesus was on earth, he was the place to go to connect with God because he is God. He was the one to be worshipped. And so he is associating himself not just with the temple, he's saying he is the temple. There's a reason why in AD 70, 70 AD, AD 70, that the temple was destroyed and it's never been built again. Why? Because it isn't necessary. And another thing we will see in John, we already saw how he was the replacement for wine, right? He was the replacement for physical wine because he's going to give bounty in heaven. Now he's saying, I'm the replacement of the temple. I'm the one that connects people to God. I'm the one that will allow people to have a relationship with God, not that altar, not the temple. And so 3 years later, when they crucified him, they came to Pilate with this remarkable story. When they said that he said, I will destroy the temple and build it back up, which isn't what he said. They could have been referring to this occasion at that time. But the irony is that not only did they not understand, the disciples didn't understand yet. They will eventually, just not until after he rises from the dead. And then the last one, we'll end with this, and we'll pick it up here tomorrow. He knows all people. Only God can do that. I can't know what's in your hearts. I can't know what's in your mind, but God does. Jesus does. And so that shows the deity as well, that he knows what's in man. We'll pick up here tomorrow. And then you'll have your chapter